Hello and welcome to eviCore Healthcare's educational webinar series. My name is Bill Cornelius and I'm the moderator for today's event. eviCore is a company that empowers the improvement of care by connecting patients, providers, and health plans with intelligent evidence-based solutions to enable better outcomes. If you would like to learn more about eviCore, please reach out to sales@evicore.com for more information. Throughout 2021, eviCore will host free educational webinars that include guest speakers, as well as eviCore subject matter experts, to discuss today's most pressing healthcare topics. Stay tuned for our future webinars with new topics presented each month. And now it is my privilege to introduce you to our panelists. First, from eviCore, Dr. Stephen Hamilton, Chief of Medical Oncology Services, and Richard Emery, Vice President of Comprehensive Oncology Strategy. We're also honored to have Dr. Crystal Denlinger, Senior Vice President and Chief Scientific Officer from the National Comprehensive Cancer Network. Together, they will discuss various topics in the world of oncology clinical trials, including how trials are designed, implemented, and administered, the benefits trials bring to patients and society, and finally, the challenges associated with clinical trial enrollment, as well as efforts to address those challenges. Before we begin, just a quick reminder to please submit your questions using the question feature in WebEx. This presentation will be recorded and will be available on demand on the Insights page at evicore.com. Rick, I'll turn it over to you now.
Thank you, Bill. And hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're going to talk about an important topic, medical oncology clinical trials. I'm joined by Dr. Stephen Hamilton from eviCore and Dr. Crystal Denlinger of the National Comprehensive Cancer Network. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rick.
Every day, patients with cancer make decisions, as you know, about their care, right, in conjunction with their doctors, family, and loved ones. Some of these patients are given the opportunity to participate in a clinical trial and possibly receive a new investigational treatment with the hope of delivering improved outcomes as compared to the current standard of care. Despite evidence that, on average, patients are more likely to achieve better outcomes when they participate in a clinical trial, actually only about 1 in 20 adult patients do so. As a result, approximately 1 in 5 clinical trials actually fail because they're unable to enroll enough patients. The stakes are high for both current and future cancer patients, as well as society at large, because clinical trials are the gold standard by which we find new treatments that improve clinical outcomes, including overall survival. In this webinar, we will provide an overview of medical oncology clinical trials. We'll separate fact from fiction, identify the benefits associated with clinical trials, examine some of the barriers to patient enrollment, and discuss opportunities for improvement. This is really the detailed look at those learning objectives that I just shared. This will be our agenda today. So you may be wondering if medical oncology clinical trials are really all that important. To find out, we can turn to the expertise of the National Comprehensive Cancer Network, an organization that is dedicated to improving and facilitating quality, effective, efficient, and accessible cancer care so patients can live better lives. The NCCN maintains industry-leading clinical practice guidelines for patients, clinicians, and other healthcare professionals. It may surprise you to know that the NCCN believes that the best management for any patient with cancer is in a clinical trial, which makes their position pretty clear. And yet, less than 5% of adults with cancer enroll in clinical trials. So how do we explain this discrepancy? Let's start to answer this question by understanding the impact of the Affordable Care Act and how that affected patient access to clinical trials. And for that, I'm pleased to hand off to Dr. Crystal Denlinger, of the Chief Science Officer of the NCCN. Crystal?
Thank you, Rick. So PACO, which took effect in January of 2014, was the first federal law to mandate that health plans cover the standard of care medical costs that were associated with enrollment in a clinical trial. Prior to that time, Medicare had covered routine costs of clinical trials since 2000, and about half the states mandated that private insurance companies do the same to cover those routine costs associated with clinical trial enrollment. There had been a study published in 2010 describing the Johns Hopkins experience with clinical trial coverage prior to the initiation of PPACA from 2003 to 2008, and reported that nearly 14% of patients were denied coverage for clinical trial participation. So the passage of the ACA provision really held the promise of improving clinical trial enrollment. A subsequent study published by MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston found that insurance clearance for clinical trial enrollment increased from 85% in the year prior to the passing of the ACA provision taking effect to 95% the year after that provision took effect, demonstrating that in fact this federal law did facilitate the potential for increased clinical trial enrollment. There are a number of stakeholders that are involved in clinical trial research, and I'll touch on a few during the course of our talk. Perhaps the most important are the participants and the patients that enroll in a clinical trial. As Rick mentioned earlier, clinical trial enrollment among adults in oncology trials is less than 5%, which really means that 1 in 5 clinical trials that is initiated fails because of lack of enrollment, not necessarily because of lack of effectiveness. But in the pediatric oncology space, clinical trial enrollment is much higher at 50 to 60%, which really accelerates the development of new effective therapies and better outcomes for pediatric cancer patients, and also demonstrates that high enrollment in clinical trials is really potentially possible for adults. Funders and sponsors play a very important role in clinical trial design and completion. Industry pharmaceutical sponsors are responsible for about 1/3 of clinical trials in terms of funding, and public sponsors like the NIH and the NCI sponsor about 10% of oncology clinical trials. Academic institutions and large cooperative groups account for the remainder, which is about the other half of clinical trials. Providers are an important stakeholder in clinical trials as well, serving as both the principal investigator of a study or sub-investigators or co-investigators on the studies. And providers are involved also potentially in the clinical trial design process, especially for investigator-initiated trials. And they also play a very critical role in enrolling patients onto clinical trials. Payers, of course, have an important role because they support clinical trial participation by covering the costs of standard of care associated with clinical trials. And governmental agencies such as the NCI and the platform clinicaltrials.gov play an important role in disseminating information, aggregating clinical trial information in a publicly available searchable database on their websites. Next slide. Thank you. There are 4 primary phases to clinical trials, and these all typically develop from preclinical data and operate under an investigational new drug application or an IND. I think what's important to understand is the true purpose of each one of these trials. So for a phase 1 study, we are focusing on the safety of a novel compound or a novel intervention and what is the optimal dose, with the primary objective being the safety of the agent or intervention. When you get to phase 2 trials, that's really to determine where there is efficacy or if there is efficacy of this particular agent or intervention. Phase 2 trials will still continue to evaluate safety as well and provide more information on the safety profile of a particular agent or intervention. Phase 3 trials really answer the comparative question, whereby we're comparing an experimental therapy to the standard of care in a randomized fashion. This population is supposed to look more closely at how the intervention behaves or performs in a larger, more generalizable population. And then phase 4 studies are really post-approval confirmatory studies, really evaluating long-term safety and effectiveness, and may also be associated with real-world outcome studies. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dr. Hamilton to provide an overview of the clinical trial design process.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Dinglinger. I'll get your name out. I apologize. I want to highlight some important clinical trial design features and really compare the classic design features to some recent innovations that have occurred in oncology clinical trials. And so to begin with, when we talk about a treatment arm in oncology trials, that really refers to a particular treatment approach under investigation. And as you just heard, I mean, in the classic design, this usually means two arms. There's the experimental arm and the standard of care arm. However, in recent years, there have been some unique multiple arm trial designs like umbrella and platform trials. So in umbrella trials, patients are assigned to one of several different treatment arms based upon the biomarker mutations identified within their tumor. Platform trials is another multi-arm design, and what's really unique about the design of this trial is that as the trial progresses, unsuccessful arms may be dropped and new arms added. And these types of multi-arm trial designs can really help uncover promising treatment options more quickly than the standard two-arm design. Now, when it comes to tumor specificity in the classic design, the clinical trial is usually designed around very tumor type specific cancers. For example, only patients with breast cancer would be eligible for the clinical trial. A recent innovation are tumor type agnostic trials. So in these particular trials, cancer type does not matter. So it could be breast cancer or lung cancer or any other tumor type. And what is required is that the tumor has a specific mutation or biomarker. And all patients will receive a targeted therapy drug. And these type of trials are called basket trials. And it's a design feature that is really advancing the field of precision oncology and personalized medicine. Patient eligibility criteria is a design feature which is usually restrictive in the classic design. And what I mean by that is it really limits access to the clinical trial based on features like age, organ function, performance status of the patient. However, the NCI has recently released new eligibility criteria which are more inclusive. And the hope is that this expanded eligibility will increase the number of patients enrolled on clinical trials and make the results of clinical trials more applicable to a broader population of patients. Now, when we look at organizational perspective, the classic design are usually centralized trials, and that is often limited just to a handful of institutions. And what that means for patients is that if they want to be enrolled on that trial, they have to travel to that institution. But a recent advance are so-called decentralized trials, and virtual clinical trials are a great example of this, where using telemedicine capabilities and remote patient monitoring technology, patients are allowed to be enrolled in a clinical trial without having to leave their local community. And then finally, assessment of response to chemotherapy and measurement of toxicity from chemotherapy is an important design feature, and classically was based on our experience with cytotoxic chemotherapy drugs. However, with the advent of novel therapies like immunotherapy and targeted therapy drugs, new criteria have been developed to measure response and toxicity to these class of drugs. So we really are currently in an exciting time when the clinical trial design researchers are really experimenting with innovative design features to help answer some important clinical questions. And now I'm going to change gears and just discuss the FDA approval process for new drugs. And I'm going to start with the standard review process, but also talk a little bit about the accelerated approval process. So to begin, a drug sponsor must submit the investigational new drug application to the FDA before they can even start a clinical trial. Now, once the IND is approved by the FDA, the sponsor then initiates and completes the clinical trial, and that can sometimes take many years. When the sponsor feels that the data from the clinical trial is sufficient to support the FDA approval, they can submit a new drug application or a biologic licensing agreement to the FDA. And then following a very thorough review, the FDA will decide to either approve or deny the application, or occasionally they may request additional information. If the FDA approves the drug, they will then review drug labeling and prescribing information. And then finally, the FDA will inspect the manufacturing facility before mass production and marketing of a new cancer drug can occur. Last year, due to COVID-19 travel restrictions, the FDA had to postpone some facility inspections, and this actually led to some delays in new drug approvals. So that's the standard process. Now, in 1992, the FDA introduced an accelerated approval process to enable faster approval for serious conditions like cancer, where the drug might fill an unmet medical need. This accelerated approval process sets a lower clinical threshold for approval as compared to the standard process. And because of this lower threshold, the FDA requires post-approval confirmatory trial data using more robust clinical outcome measures. And then if this confirmatory trial fails to support the safety and effectiveness of the accelerated approved drug, then the FDA may withdraw its approval. And a recent example of this occurred in April this year when the FDA held a special 3-day session to review the accelerated approvals of 6 different checkpoint inhibitor drugs that had expanded indications. And so checkpoint inhibitors are drugs like Keytruda and Tecentriq. The confirmatory trials for these indications actually failed to meet the required clinical outcomes. But despite the failure of confirmatory trials to meet their primary endpoints, ODAC, which is the Oncology Committee for the FDA, they actually recommended that the accelerated approvals not be withdrawn for 4 of the 6 indications. And that was a move that surprised some observers. The FDA has yet to announce its final decision on these accelerated approvals. However, the special session did raise some questions about the accelerated approval process and the requirements for confirmatory trial data. And so now Dr. Denlinger is going to overview the clinical trial experience from a provider and a patient experience perspective.
Thank you, Dr. Hamilton. So before we get into some of the nitty-gritty of the experience, I'm going to speak a little bit about my own personal experience as the daughter of a clinical trial participant, which actually helped inform my approach to being a clinical trialist and physician. So my dad was treated for kidney cancer between 1993 and 2008 when there were very few drugs available for his disease. And during that time, he participated in a phase 1 clinical trial of a new combination therapy. And despite being told that it was a safety study, I and my family, my dad, really saw this as a therapeutic option for him. Unfortunately, my dad had some pretty significant side effects while on study. And it was this experience that actually shaped my careful approach to how I discuss a clinical trial, especially phase 1 studies, and go through the informed consent process with my patients. So informed consent really is a process. It is not just the informed consent document. When you are doing an informed consent, you must ensure that the patient not only understands the purpose of the trial and the objectives of the trial, but what the risks and potential benefits are for participation. We also have to discuss what the standard of care would be and what the alternative other options might be, including the potential for palliative care and no additional therapy, and really provide time for the patient and their caregivers to ask questions and consider participation before they sign the document. One concern that participants in clinical trials always voice is the randomization process and potentially the preference for the experimental therapy or one therapy arm in a trial versus another. For example, patients may think that the experimental therapy is better than the standard therapy, even though the purpose of the trial is actually to find that out. It's really important to, as a provider, to explain the concept of clinical equipoise, which means that the study arms are designed that there is not one quote unquote better intervention for either the control arm or the experimental arm, especially in the design of a randomized clinical trial. Becoming a clinical investigator is a multi-step process. In addition to really participating in the training associated with a specific protocol, clinical investigators must obtain and maintain certification in human subjects protection and good clinical practice. Investigators, principal investigators will also have to navigate a clinical trial protocol through an entire regulatory process that involves both scientific and ethical review, which will provide safeguards to ensure that trials are really conducted both safely and ethically and as much as possible. Once a patient agrees to participate in a trial, there is a whole team of clinical trial staff that follow a strictly defined protocol for supporting, evaluating, managing, and treating the trial participants. This typically involves a combination of diagnostic studies and clinical assessments. And in general, patients who participate in a clinical trial are very closely supported and monitored with an eye to both safety and toxicity. Clinical research coordinators and nurses play a vital role in this process because they help both the physician investigator and the clinical trial participant and their family members navigate the entire protocol requirement. So next, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and review the benefits of a clinical trial. So we know that it's important that the first and highest benefit that we see is that patients who participate in a clinical trial receive high quality care due to the fact that there's a number of stakeholders I've already reviewed involved, and there is strict compliance oversight. The enrollment in a clinical trial may not only include the care with the experimental agent, but it also includes defining supportive care to ensure that the participants have the highest chance of actually staying enrolled on the study. Of course, we already know that clinical trials offer patients access to new and potentially more effective therapies before they're widely available to the general patient population. But what you may not know is that a recent study of over 11,000 patients enrolled in a wide variety of oncology clinical trials demonstrated significantly improved overall survival at 5 years for patients who participated in clinical trials. The authors of this study believe that this effect may actually be secondary to a number of factors associated with clinical trial enrollment, including a higher level of care, improved quality assurance, and early referral to palliative care, which in and of itself is associated with a survival benefit. Another critically important benefit to participation in clinical trials is that we advance our scientific knowledge. This is how we bring new drugs to future cancer patients and improve cancer care. For providers, clinical trials can actually be useful as well because they can be a market differentiator for their particular center as compared to their neighboring cancer practitioners. And for payers, clinical trials can be helpful because there is the potential for reduced drug costs as the cost of the experimental agent and some of the ancillary services associated with that agent are covered by the trial sponsor as opposed to the payer. There was actually a presentation at this year's ASCO annual meeting that showed a reduction in drug spending for patients on clinical trials compared to those not enrolled. So as you can see, the benefits for enrollment in clinical trials are many. You may be wondering, of course, what happens after a patient participates in a clinical trial and the clinical trial identifies a new standard of care. Dr. Hamilton is going to help us understand how new clinical trial evidence translates in the real world.
Yeah, thank you. And I want to just highlight, that there are some limitations with clinical trial data. We've seen that clinical trials often have a highly selected patient population, excluding patients who maybe have poor performance status, advanced age, or have comorbidities. And also, ethnic and racial minorities are extremely underrepresented in clinical trials. The vast majority of patients enrolled in clinical trials in the United States are non-Hispanic whites. And this lack of diversity can really limit the applicability of clinical trial results across various racial and ethnic populations. So one strategy to address these issues is through real-world outcome data, which, as we talked about previously, could be a phase 4 clinical trial, but is sometimes just a simple observation study. And these studies look at the impact of approved therapies on populations underrepresented in original clinical trials. So these type of real-world studies provide invaluable insights into the safety and efficacy of the approved treatments across a wide variety of patient populations, including, racial, ethnic minorities, the elderly, those with underlying comorbidities. And this type of information is very beneficial to the treating oncologist, giving them important data regarding the applicability of clinical trial data to their patient population. And now I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about some of the challenges associated with clinical trial enrollment. And first, there can be structural barriers to clinical trial enrollment. So many patients live hundreds of miles from an institution that is participating in clinical trials, and this lack of access can greatly hamper clinical trial enrollment. In addition, for half of patients, there may not be an appropriate clinical trial available for their particular condition. As far as clinical barriers to enrollment, these can include the restrictive eligibility criteria that I discussed previously, which can limit access to clinical trials for 20% or more of patients because of things like comorbidities. And then when we speak about physician attitudinal barriers to clinical trial enrollment, it's really important to note that physician preference leads to non-participation in clinical trials for more than half of patients. So we do need to really understand why physicians may not encourage clinical trial enrollment. And one reason that's frequently cited is the lack of resources or sufficient incentives for providers to participate in clinical trials. So enrolling a patient in a clinical trial is a major commitment for the provider. I mean, it requires extra time and data collection compared to non-clinical trial patients. There also exists the potential for interference of the patient and physician relationship, particularly if the patient has to go to another cancer center to be enrolled in the clinical trial. And then there's the economic reality that referring a patient to another facility means loss of practice revenue for the treating oncologist. As far as patient attitudinal barriers, one common hindrance to enrollment are the patient's perceived risk and benefits of entering the clinical trial. And so we talked about this idea of randomization can be intimidating to patients. I mean, they may truly believe that the experimental arm is superior to the other arm. Some also don't like the idea of being, quote unquote, a lab rat. They want to instead receive proven treatments. And then I do want to just call out that there are a number of social determinants of health that impact clinical trial enrollment, such as limited access to care, education level, and even unconscious bias from providers that can limit discussions of clinical trial options for disadvantaged populations. And then finally, lack of awareness of clinical trial opportunities by both providers and patients can limit participation. So these are a few examples of barriers, but fortunately there are things that can be done to address these barriers, and Dr. Denlinger will now discuss some of these.
Thank you. So there are multiple ways to address some of the barriers associated with clinical trial enrollment, and I think the pandemic highlighted where we may be able to utilize some of the technology and resources that we utilized to treat patients on a pandemic during the pandemic for clinical trials. So for example, access barriers may be overcome by employing telehealth and other health technology platforms and decentralizing some of those required standard assessments that occur during a clinical trial. Clinical barriers may be overcome by broadening eligibility criteria, such as what the NCI is suggesting, to be more reflective of the actual oncology population, thus allowing for a larger inclusion of older adults and those with comorbid conditions, which are more highly represented in the larger oncology population. To overcome some of those attitudinal barriers that Dr. Hamilton mentioned, physicians may need to be incentivized or somehow included in the clinical trial process, or provide the resources and support to enroll their patients in a trial, which may not actually be at their site. Patients also will need to be educated regarding the benefits of safeguards in place for a clinical trial, while ensuring that enrolling in a clinical trial does not result in excess out-of-pocket costs to them, nor that the social determinants of health will become a barrier to care. Finally, the entire community really needs to have increased awareness of what clinical trial opportunities exist, not only in their immediate region, but in the larger care community, as regional limitations to care are becoming increasingly overcome by these virtual care platforms and pragmatic trial designs. And for that, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Hamilton for our last slide.
Yeah, and in order to really improve provider awareness of clinical trial opportunities, eviCore has recently developed a clinical trial matching capability within our standard prior authorization process. And we leverage our prior authorization clinical decision support tool, where we collect a lot of clinical information about the patient during the prior authorization process. And then we're able to conduct an immediate behind-the-scenes query of the NCI clinical trial database during the standard prior authorization process. We can then display a list of potential clinical trial matches for the patient, for the provider to review in real time, listed in order of proximity to the patient's home. If the provider wants more information about any of these trials that are surfaced, they can click a hyperlink and get it immediately to the NCI website, or they can simply check the trials they want and we can fax or email them the information on those clinical trials. And so this program really does improve provider awareness of clinical trial opportunities, and it may also open up additional treatment options for patients. Now, we just implemented this program back in April, so it's really too early to know if the program will actually increase clinical trial enrollment. That's our hope. But we are seeing providers request additional information on the listed clinical trials that were surfaced through the NCI database query, which is an early promising trend. So that ends today's presentation, and I'm now going to turn it back over to Rick to see if there's any questions from the audience.
Thank you so much, Dr. Denlinger and Dr. Hamilton. That was fantastic. Certainly, it's clear that clinical trials are extremely important for patients with cancer, but for society at large, right? We all have a vested interest in wanting to see evidence develop as rapidly as possible. And so just a reminder to all of our participants that if you have questions, please submit them as a Q&A button within the WebEx, and you can go ahead and just type your question, and then we'll to the extent that time is available, we'll go ahead and ask those of our presenters. We have about another 15 minutes that we can devote to Q&A. So really, I mean, I feel like there's so many challenges to clinical trial enrollment, but at the same time, there's been such tremendous innovation in this space, right, to try to improve upon those challenges. I really feel a great sense of optimism with regard to the work that's being done, and it's truly multi-stakeholder, right? It's not just one, organization or one person. It's everyone coming together with this common purpose and of helping patients with cancer achieve better outcomes, including overall survival. Now we know that there is a minority of plans today, a minority of employer groups in particular who still have exempted status from the Affordable Care Act, that clinical trial coverage benefit requirement. And so when you think about those payers who have made that decision to remain exempted, are they really acting in their own best interest? Or are they acting in the best interest of their beneficiaries with regard to medical oncology clinical trials? And I'm wondering, Dr. Denglinger, if you may be the best to respond to this question.
Yeah, so thanks. The short answer is no. I think not denying coverage, or basically denying coverage for a clinical trial enrollment for patients with cancer, really isn't in anyone's best interest. The option to participate in a clinical trial really should be available to all patients, because it may help both improve patient outcomes for an individual patient and may also lower costs, again, because some of the potential drug costs are covered as part of the clinical trial. And in fact, in allowing enrollment for clinical trials allows for improved outcomes across all patients, not just the ones included in the beneficiary group, because if those clinical trials are successful in establishing new standards of care, now we have new and better standards of care. So I don't see a reason where there's a best interest to deny enrollment in clinical trials.
Okay, thank you. And just to follow up to that, just trying to put myself in the shoes of let's say an employer who does not have a clinical trial benefit as part of their coverage. They might be, I suspect, right? They might have made that decision either because they just haven't given the subject much time or consideration since the Affordable Care Act went into effect, or maybe it could be based on misinformation. And certainly, as we've heard today, there's quite a bit of misinformation out there in the general public. Any suggestions on how we might be able to reach these decision makers and influence them to add the clinical trial benefit to their coverage plan?
Yeah, I think education is a great way to do this. Health plans are really in a good position to educate their employer clients on the advantages and the importance of clinical trials, and therefore having a clinical trial benefit for their enrolled members. And I think other educational outreach from the health plan perspective and in situations like this, where we can just talk about the benefits of clinical trial enrollment that may extend past the actual therapeutic benefit of a given trial.
Excellent, thank you. And yeah, I agree wholeheartedly. I think education and awareness are key to this. Okay, so next question. So we heard from you both in this presentation that pediatric oncology clinical trial enrollment is over 50%, whereas for adults, it's less than 5%. How is this difference seen in clinical outcomes today? Dr. Hamilton, would you like to take that?
Sure. That high clinical trial enrollment among pediatric patients with cancer is really responsible for a much faster evolution of the clinical evidence for this group of patients compared to adults. And if we could increase clinical trial enrollment in adults, we could see faster evidence development in that population as well.
Excellent. So there is a correlation, right, between clinical trial enrollment and evidence development. And do you have any particular, can you think of any examples where, in your clinical experience, you're seeing a difference from a practical perspective?
Yeah, one that pops into mind is in adult oncology with metastatic triple-negative breast cancer, which is really a particularly challenging population of patients where our standard chemotherapy regimens are really associated with pretty poor outcomes. And because of this, these patients were enrolled in clinical trials at a higher than normal rate, which led to a recent approval of several new, really innovative treatments in a relatively short period of time that have improved the outcomes of this patient population. But I did come across some really interesting data to look at this because it made the best way to show the impact of clinical trial enrollment on outcome maybe to compare survival for pediatric patients who are less than age 15 versus those that are age 15 to 19, the so-called adolescent young adult population. So while clinical trial enrollment is 50% in patients less than 15, the rate of clinical trial enrollment in that adolescent and young adult population is less than 20%, substantially less than in the younger pediatric population. The higher clinical trial enrollment among patients less than 15 really has accelerated the evidence and led to development of new treatments which have resulted in higher survival rates for this younger group of patients across most pediatric cancer types when you compare that to the adolescents. So I think these are two examples that really can highlight the positive impact that a higher clinical trial enrollment can have on clinical outcomes.
That's great. Thank you, Dr. Hamilton. And I mean, it sort of intuitively makes sense, right? We would expect that. We would expect that, well, if you want to develop evidence, you need more patients enrolled, and the more you can enroll into clinical trials, the faster you're going to develop that evidence. But it's great to hear that that expectation or that hypothesis actually proves out in practice. So here's another really good question for you. And let's see, I'll address this one to you, Dr. Denglinger. And this, I've been in the field of oncology for 30 years, so I've heard this countless times. There's a common misperception that clinical trials are the last resort option, right? You don't go on a clinical trial until it's like the last possible option for you. And how do you respond to this?
Yeah, so I think that is an experience that we all have when we work in clinical medicine at a site where clinical trials are available. And my patients have also expressed surprise when I bring a clinical trial up as an option for adjuvant therapy or frontline therapy. But as you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, the NCCN actually takes a very strong position on this, which is that the best management for a patient with cancer is actually on a clinical trial. Clinical trials, as Dr. Hamilton mentioned, have really been responsible for evolving the standards of care in both the curative and the advanced disease setting. And the only way we can continue to do that is to actually have active clinical trials in all stages of disease and in all phases of treatment, which will build the body of evidence that ultimately drives and refines the standard of care. So our current standard of care is really driven by the results of yesterday's clinical trials landscape. And if we don't continue to feed that and continue to enroll patients on trials to answer the next generation of questions, we're not going to continue to evolve our standard of care if we wait for just the last resort stop to enroll our patients on study.
That's great, perfect, and it just helps to underscore too the importance of education and awareness among all stakeholders, and I would say in particular patients, their family members, loved ones, as well as payers who are the ones who are especially those who are still holding out on that clinical trial benefit for their beneficiaries. So thank you for that. Okay, so let's see, we've got another question. So how different, so you mentioned, I think Dr. Hamilton, was your slide, you mentioned that there are different clinical endpoints for a standard FDA approval process versus an accelerated FDA approval process. can you expand on what those endpoints are and why is it important that, the two are using different endpoints?
Yeah, great question. So standard clinical trial endpoints in oncology are overall survival and progression-free survival. Overall survival is probably fairly self-explanatory, but it's the length of time between the initial diagnosis or when the patient starts treatment and the patient's longevity. Progression-free survival is the length of time that the patient lives with their cancer, but it doesn't get worse. The cancer's still there, but it's not advancing. And those are kind of our standard clinical trial endpoints, overall survival being the strongest evidence. The FDA's accelerated drug approval process allows for what are called surrogate endpoints, which are outcomes used in place of the standard endpoints like overall survival to gauge if a treatment works. And so a surrogate endpoint includes things like response rate, which measures tumor shrinkage or other sign that the cancer may be less active in the patient's body. Surrogate endpoints are used because the results of these endpoints can be measured sooner than overall survival and progression-free survival, which sometimes takes many years to monitor. However, surrogate endpoints are not always reliable indicators that the treatment will improve survival, which is why the FDA really requires these follow-up confirmatory trials that measure standard clinical endpoints.
Okay, that's great. I mean, that actually helps to, further explain why, as you mentioned, the FDA has been reviewing 6, indications for checkpoint inhibitors that received accelerated approval based upon, these more, I guess they're easier to or faster to measure, right? Endpoints like tumor response. But then, still they have this requirement that, okay, we're going to approve you based on this accelerated, quicker to report metric. But then you still need to follow up with these confirmatory trials to show that there is either an overall survival or progression-free survival benefit. And if that doesn't, in fact, happen, then it calls, the whole approval into question.
Right.
But, I mean, the process, that makes more sense now, given that explanation. And, why, we, the FDA, and we as a society would choose to grant accelerated approvals for certain drugs for certain indications when there may not be great treatment options for patients under
Right.
Our standard of care therapies. So that's very helpful. Thank you. At this point, I'm not seeing any additional questions, so I'm going to just ask for the audience one more time. If you have any questions, one last chance to go ahead and post one more. I think we have time for just 1 or 2 more questions, if there are any there. And give that just a moment. So we're just getting some comments of excellent presentation and thank you and great information. That is wonderful. Thank you so much for that feedback as well. I think if that is it in terms of questions, I want to move to just thank Dr. Hamilton and Dr. Denglinger for their expert presentations today and their expert answers to our questions. I'm just very grateful to both of you for sharing your subject matter expertise on this important topic. And as I'm wrapping up, I see there was one question that just came through, which I think I can answer. It says, will there be communication to the providers regarding the new service you're providing with matching? So yes, absolutely. So we have just launched this clinical trial match capability, and our initial launch was with one health plan. We wanted to, make sure everything's working well and providers are happy with it. And we are finding that so far it seems like it's working very well and it's adding value. So before we launched that, we did send a communication to all providers who might be affected by this new feature. And as we continue to expand and roll out that feature to our other health plan clients, we will also communicate with providers proactively. We believe that's very important, and to provide them the information, but also the education. I do want to point out too, with that match service, we have implemented it in such a way that it is minimally impactful with regard to the physician workflow. It is one mouse click. So if the providers are just absolutely not interested in a clinical trial, it takes them one mouse click to move on. So it is designed in a very provider-friendly way. So I'll thank you for that question and just go back to my wrap up. So I want to thank all of you who joined today, all of our participants. Thank you for your attention. We know your time is valuable. We hope that you found this webinar to be very informative, and in turn, we're hoping to spread awareness, right, and dispel myths about medical oncology clinical trials, so that you too can in turn help to spread awareness and education and information. And to the extent that we here at eviCore can do anything to help you with that, please do not hesitate to reach out. Also, in addition, we did just complete a podcast on clinical trials. And if you're interested in that, we have an eviCore podcast. It's called Off the Cuff. Haha, auth for authorization. We'll play on words there. And there's a new episode on oncology clinical trials that we just recorded yesterday. It'll be released later this month. And you can listen to our podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. And now Bill Cornelius will provide some closing remarks. So again, thank you all.
Thank you, Rick. This concludes the Q&A portion of our webinar. This webinar was recorded and will be available on demand by visiting evicore.com. Please remember to register for our upcoming webinars. You will receive an email invitation with the opportunity to do so. If you would like to learn more about our capabilities, please reach out to sales@evicore.com. Thank you again, Rick and Drs. Hamilton and Denlinger, for sharing your expert knowledge with us today. Participants, thank you for all of you in attendance, and this concludes our webinar. Have a great day.